it can't be something where you feel like it invalidates everything that you've done to that point or everything that you've thought. And it can't be something where you try and chase that in the next season. That probably will kill you.
I saw today we got the official Apex Fantasy League invite to the MFL league that we do. What year? This has got to be like year 12. I mean, it's been a minute. It's a long standing league. And I saw that we got the draft order, and lo and behold, I got the 7 spot and you got the 8 spot, and I am not very happy about it. Not very happy about it, but it should be fun.
It should be. That's a great league that Mike Brody runs. And it's always so fun to see what everybody wants to do early in August.
Mm-hmm.
We have some information now, right? And so we're able to tweak a few things that maybe we got wrong. But as soon as these preseason games start for real, and then even in the last, week and a half, we see a lot of movement. So it's great to see what you did back in the MFL 10 of Death. I was checking in on a few of our picks here before the show to see where we were at for that, and then where we are for Apex, and then where we are here in a couple weeks.
I gotta say, I walked away from the MFL because, I obviously that the MFL 10 of Death that we do is a best ball league that 12 for those of you who don't know, is a best ball league that 12 of us do every year, and it started before the rush of best ball, with DraftKings and with Underdog and such, and so we've just done it on MFL. Pat Thorman puts it together every year. And we do it usually in May. I think this one might have been a couple weeks later, the start. But I got to say, I look back at that draft and I have not been drafting my teams in that way almost at all throughout, even the individual players that I was drafting. I always go back and I've realized that, I've had probably my worst success in the MFL 10 of Death compared to most of the leagues that are kind of yearly for me. And I think it's just that I am not confident enough in my takes in May and doing my research for the draft guide and such and the strategic side of things. And then once I get into, later June and into July after the draft guide's published, that's where I feel like I'm in a real rhythm. So if anyone sees that MFL 10 of Death board and you see my team, don't think that those are really my strong player takes or anything. Look at the Apex League. It'll be a more, accurate description and depiction of how I'm thinking about things right now.
Well, I loved your picks at the 1-2 turn.
Oh, that's good.
To have Genty
and then stopped, and then after that it was just over.
And you get Bowers there, and one of the things that we know in that league is that even though this, to my mind, is not what the data suggests, we know that the drafters are going to completely ignore tight end, and so you got Bowers, I got McBride, I came back later and took Hawkinson. We'll talk about tight ends a little bit later. But if we had a show together at that point, I would have asked you about some of the later selections. How much of that is projection based? How much of it is that? One of the things I noted in my write-up, I did a controversial players piece from it.
Yeah.
I was like, at some point, Javonte Williams is draftable. The question is where that is.
That was easily, Shawn. I walked away from that draft and I was like, why the hell did I take Javonte Williams? I haven't taken, I've been so into Jaden Blue and have hyped him up on the show and, my prospect guide, like the prospect stuff that I work with, love Blue as a prospect. And for whatever reason, I was kind of stuck. It's sometimes in drafts, you get stuck at a point where you literally have no direction that you want to go in. And I, at that point, was just like, okay, it's May. I'm going to rely on projections right now, which is something that I literally never do, especially at that point in the draft. When you're in the middle rounds and stuff. And so I drafted Javonte Williams, and even in my best ball portfolio, I think I'm at 2% Javonte. It's just not a thing that I have pushed towards and gone towards. I think I took Tyrone Tracy in that draft though too, who is someone
that one's
that I've actually
good.
Yeah. The Tracy one, I feel okay about, but the Javonte pick was the one where I'm like, what am I doing after, you make those selections?
Was it a real gut blow when Blue went a couple picks later?
Yes.
Were you like, I should have just picked my guy?
Yeah, because that happens all the in these kinds of drafts. You can't, when you're drafting with sharp people, you just can't get away with stuff, right? And that's a trying to get away with stuff kind of move where you're like, Yes, I wish I would have just taken him, taken Blue, or honestly just not gone with either at that point in the draft, because I think it was still probably just not the right time and not the right spot. But I don't try. I try not to like dwell on the MFL 10 of death because it's obviously not the biggest league in the world. But yeah, that was definitely a draft that I walked away from. I'm like, I like some of the guys that I got, but overall, not my standard build, not really like the go to for me here in 2024. But I have so many questions, or sorry, 2025. I have so many questions that I want to ask you though. I think a lot of people at this point, you're a returning guest on Perspectives. And so we don't have to dig into your background, all of that kind of stuff. We talked a little bit about some of that the last time you were on, I'm sure. The one thing I want to dig into first is sort of a 10,000-foot view of this 2025 season. And you do a great job of this every year. It's something that I'm really passionate at looking at. You and Gretch together are probably the best duo at sort of looking at this kind of stuff. But when you look at the 2024 season and what we saw last year, what's one thing that happened in fantasy football that you think managers into this season, because we know that managers are going to be reactionary. We know that they're, they fall victim to recency bias all the time. What's something that you think that people might overrate or overstate as we draft now that we're in the thick of things in August for this 2025 season?
So I think it has to be the health and the viability of running backs. I remember, week 11 till somewhere in there, like deep into the season, it was during one of the weeks where McCaffrey actually played, which would be helpful to this point. But something like 22 of the first 23 backs drafted were playing that week.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's pretty unique. We also got strong performances from a lot of the guys who had lagging peripherals, both from the previous season and even guys who were having lagging peripherals in season were scoring points. You got a lot of touchdowns from some of those players. And so you have this combination of good health, high scoring, including from probably players who either had age concerns, which tends to bring a lot of risk with it, and or just aren't that good of players. And when those guys are all scoring, it really changes what the running back landscape looks like. And I didn't necessarily think that was a surprise because, I mean, every season is just not the same at all. And you can have seasons that are really dramatically out of the norm. And I actually thought that it might happen, or that things were set up for running backs to have a big impact even the previous season, because we saw a big ADP shift at that point, where coming off of 2015, right, we have the running back apocalypse, and you have an ADP shift. And then on the heels of that ADP shift, you have this pretty unique season where running backs stay healthy, veterans score, everybody scores at the running back position, and it pushes everything back in the other direction. And one of the things I had been trying to communicate to listeners and subscribers is that type of season is going to happen at some point. And if you're not prepared for it in some way with how you're approaching your leagues, or as it's happening, you feel like it's some betrayal of how football works, how fantasy football works, just life in general, that this is incredibly unfair, then you haven't really positioned yourself or understood that these types of seasons are going to be in there. They're going to be pretty infrequent. We know that from the way that the shape of scoring has gone, over the last decade, this century, what have you. We know they're going to be rare, but they're going to be in there. And when they happen, it can't be something where you feel like it invalidates everything that you've done to that point or everything that you've thought. And it can't be something where you try and chase that in the next season. That probably will kill you. Although, again, we don't know. Seasons are going to be crazy.
Yeah, true. Yeah. I would agree. I mean, I one of the first topics that I dug into this offseason after the season ended was that, just to say, hey, is a running back renaissance really happening, or what happened this past year? And it's crazy the kind of domino effect the lack of injuries has and had last year. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the top of the position, it really wasn't anything more substantial or better than what we'd seen historically. And by top, I mean like top 5, top 6 type players, right? Like Saquon Barkley's season was really special, but it wasn't really special from a PPR points per game perspective, right? Like it wasn't
It
like
was
he was
only special
catching,
because he was set up for such a bad scoring environment and
right.
managed to counterbalance that with extraordinary play.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so if you look at like the top 6, top 7 running backs in the way, if you were to just layer them and say, okay, RB1 scored this many points, RB2 scored this many points, RB3, etc., the way that those top 6, top 7 running backs scored was really no different. It was actually kind of worse than what we'd seen over the decade prior, right? What really changed things was the thing that fantasy analysts have talked about and spoken about for years now in that like standard running back dead zone range, if you will, which I think is a whole other topic for conversation. But is the idea that like the Josh Jacobs of the world and all of these players stayed healthy and they were able to also have pretty decent seasons. But then what the thing that I don't think gets, and I've said it plenty on this show throughout the offseason, but I still don't think gets enough run in general, is the idea that when you don't have those injuries, like and we can talk about zero RB in a second here. But when you don't have those injuries, backup running backs are not stepping in for those players, right? So you're getting like relatively decent running backs who can carry a big workload, and they're going to score points just based on the fact that they can carry a decent workload. And then when they don't get hurt, that means backup running backs aren't stepping in, and you're not having that just insanity go on in your leagues with waivers, etc. And so as a result of that, the backup running backs, we're never selling backup running backs to just do exactly what the starting running backs would be able to do, right? Josh Jacobs goes down. Maybe he's not the best example because there would be like a very clear cut split backfield. But, Josh Jacobs goes down. Let's just assume that there's a running back let's just assume Marshawn Lloyd didn't get hurt last year and he would have stepped in and maybe been 80% of Josh Jacobs while the rest of your league, whoever drafted Josh Jacobs, was then hurting because they lost, a top 3 round pick and Jacobs. But what that does is that those RB2s are scoring more points than the traditional RB2s in the way that they finish, because the traditional RB2s are not filled with guys who are healthy all year, And so like, it's just a wild domino effect and thing that went on last year. And that I think is definitely going to impact the way that people draft this year, as you said. And I kind of want to piggyback off of that as the person who wrote about zero RB so many years ago. And look, I think I probably said it the last time we talked, but I know that when you go on shows, people ask you about zero RB the same way that they will just ask me about late round quarterback. It's just like the go-to, you got to talk about it. But I think that this year in particular, it's kind of interesting for both strategies. I think we're in a really interesting spot with both of them, and we will get to both of them. But since we're talking about running backs here, is zero RB now dead? Or is it now more alive than ever based on what you said with the injuries that did not happen last season?
So there's a lot of nuance that goes into it, even kind of setting aside this conversation about like what does zero RB mean, which we talked about last time that I was on with you.
Yeah.
We have so the thing that happens in 2025 in concert with what we just talked about is that last season the running back class, the rookies, was very weak.
Mm-hmm.
And so you maybe had a limited number of players who were going to be able to take advantage anyway, and you had a limited number of players who were going to push for starting jobs sort of on their own merits. Now, it was
Yep.
really exciting that a couple of the guys that we really liked, I'm sure you really liked, in Irving and Tracy, you had extremely high roster exposure to them, and then they actually still go and accomplish a lot of what you need from a certain type of build.
Mm-hmm.
And you throw in a Chase Brown, and you're
Right.
still able to accomplish a lot of the things, but the starters were so healthy, the backups were so weak. You go into this season, the players who were already kind of lagging peripherals wise are now a year older, and people are more comfortable with them now
Mm-hmm.
because they've done it when people said they couldn't do it. And so then everybody's like, you were wrong. Now we're comfortable with these players. And at the same time, you have I mean, maybe the greatest running back class that we've seen. Now there are two or three within the last 10 to 15 years that certainly are elite,
Yeah.
and maybe better at the top. Maybe like the top five versus top five, there are a couple of classes that are better. I would argue that when you look all the way through the draft and getting down to Brashard Smith, and then even like the last back, who is the big type monster of really the entire offseason, you have guys who are interesting. And in some cases, you have guys that I would argue are even elite. And you have a weird context because people are coming off of a year where you just didn't have that. And so it can be hard to say, okay, just the classes are so completely different. But
Yeah.
then I think also we have this tendency structurally when we're looking at prospects and we're looking at the draft to so number one, the draft makes a huge impact, and where people are
Yep.
drafted gives you a really good understanding of baseline what players drafted in those ranges have done historically, and also what a team is likely to expect and want from
Yep.
players there. And the team gets to decide the usage. So if they've drafted a player in a certain range, you get a little bit of a sense of what they plan to do with that player. At the same time, classes are very different in terms of the overall talent in them. And you can't compare a class that has a bunch of really good day three prospects to what's happened over the last 15 years and say it's going to be similar, because it's probably not. Right? The
Yeah.
player's talent is still the thing that in the end swamps everything else. It's one of the reasons that Bucky Irving and Tyrone Tracy were able to come through. Right? They had those elements to the profile that they weren't guaranteed to come through, but they had a great shot,
Sure.
and then they proved that they were that good. And so where they were drafted, the coaches were like, well, we drafted you in a spot where, we're just going to keep you on the bench. They're like, look at our starters. You're going to play.
Yeah.
We're going
Yeah.
to have more of that in 2025. And yet at the same time, I do think that the shifts, and this kind of goes to a different question that you have as well, but the shifts in the way people are playing have neutralized some of the extreme advantages of zero RB, especially in redraft. I think that best ball is different, where one of the
Mhm.
experiences I had last year was that my teams are basically all zero RB. It was a horrible season for that, and they still had a good year. Now, it does help you to hit on some guys like Chase Brown and Bucky Irving,
Right. Right.
and it helps a lot of Brock Bowers. But the idea that you're going to be completely stopped, even in a running back wave year, is just simply not true because of the structure of best ball. I mean, the structure of best ball is basically that zero RB or things in that direction are utterly dominant. And if you go against that, especially in 2-3-1 types of lineup structures,
Mhm.
you need to have just like the perfect draw to have much chance to compete with those teams. In redraft, it's very, very interesting, especially if you're playing in 2-2-2 formats, or anything where you can just play a lot of running backs, because the ADP now is interesting enough, and there's enough lack of respect for this rookie running back class. And at the same time, I dislike the wide receiver ordering to the extent that I wouldn't go out and just draft zero RB, because I actually like receivers later more. So why would you hold yourself to
Right.
a
Right.
strategy that's actually not going to get you the players? If you're if you approach a season and draft a structure that doesn't help you maximize what you have on your own rankings, it's probably
Mhm.
not the right way to do it. And for me,
Yeah.
drafting zero RB in 2025 would not get me the best rankings based team just from my own ranking set.
Yeah, can I add, or can I guess where you see problems with ADP right now? I'm gonna guess that what you're referring to is at wide receiver when you get into like round 3, and especially after like that AJ Brown. I guess we can throw Ladd McConkey in there too, even regardless of the Keenan Allen signing. But then you get into round 3, and you're staring at players who you can understand the upside profiles, but this is my experience, and I'm just assuming that you're feeling the same way based on your answer there. But you look at round 5 and into round 6, and you're like, but these guys have just as good of ceiling profiles as those guys do. Like, would we be shocked if George Pickens outscores Marvin Harrison Jr. this year? Like, would it be like that shocking of a thing to see? Or even like the way that JSN is set up right now, we love JSN the talent, but we know that situationally things are still questionable. Like, is that what you're feeling? And then if it is, does that also, this can lead us to the quarterback conversation a little bit. Does that then make you pivot to another position like a quarterback, like an elite quarterback, getting a guy like Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, because you do hit a wall where you can get a comparable player a round or two later?
Yeah, you mentioned, Pickens versus Harrison, and I really like the elite young receivers. I like betting on the second year breakouts, but I do think that all of that has to be calibrated, right?
Right.
And when we're looking at this and saying, George Pickens is likely to outscore him, not just that it's possible. And
Right.
so, I mean, if that's the case, then yeah, one of the things that I think is hard is that in 2025, there's almost no one that you want to pick in rounds 3 and 4, and then you want to make like 5 picks in round 5.
Right.
And so you have to develop an approach that allows you to have some respect for ADP, but that you also end up getting some of your guys. Because if you are really trying to play the ADP value game, then you're going to be underweight on the players with the best league winning outcomes. And this is something where in some ways it's inevitable, and in some ways it's probably correct. But we do have a little bit of the portfolio based element of best ball and the sort of risk aversion that comes with that, where it is important to not take too many zeros as you build out your best ball team. And then as you work through and you look at some of this ADP and you look at the receivers that are being elevated, because again, in best ball, you need those receivers, and you're looking at it and you're like, this has created similar dead zones to what we talked in the past about with running backs, where you're actually going for floor types of plays that, especially in formats where you get to choose your own lineup, maybe you are even still maximizing for finishing in the top third of your 12-team league. You're probably not maximizing for winning it. And certainly if you're playing in tournaments, you're probably not building teams that have the best shot to go on and compete with them, specifically, again, in redraft, where building that starting lineup. And I do think that there are some really interesting elements of the QB question that also come back to this running back health from last season. Because one of the things that I keep working through, and you look at last year, and I think you would really have liked to have had elite QBs, but part of that is that you're looking at a full healthy roster compared to other years. And you're thinking, like, I don't need to make free agent pickups. I don't need to have all of these contingency-based running back stashes on my bench because I already can't get all the good players I have into the lineup. And if you have that, then you can forego that additional, potentially big-time player at running back or wide receiver. Although, as we're talking about round 3, you're like, aren't big time players even going in that round in the area where these QBs are?
Right.
You can give that up if everybody on your roster stays healthy. It's more difficult, and that additional star at a different position is more valuable if you're in what I would think of as a more normal year with more chaos. You get into the buys, your starting lineup actually looks pretty bad. You're thinking, how do I try and deal with the damage here? The fact that I waited late and I hit on a QB, that's so much more potent then. And again, it comes down to just how deep your starting lineup has to be, but then how healthy all of your guys are. But then the additional question for tournaments is simply, okay, well, if the teams that are competing for the whole thing are just the luckiest, healthiest teams anyway, then why wouldn't you just draft as though you're going to be healthy? Which, to me, that's not exactly fantasy football. But certainly from a tournament winning perspective, it's an important thing to consider because, if you're involved in those, you do want to win the $1 million. And so, I mean, I've got lots of other things on this QB topic as well that I want to think through with you, because I do think it's fascinating. It's one of the things I've had the most trouble with this year.
Yeah.
Even to the point of looking at last year and being like, yeah, we want an elite QB. But really what we wanted was Jaden Daniels, who wasn't drafted in that range. The
Yeah,
problem,
right,
again,
right,
with
right.
individual seasons where, I mean, last year, just the two flagrantly obvious players that you needed to draft in every league were Jaden Daniels and Brock Bowers. It's really easy to say that after it's worked out.
Right.
It was
Right.
easy to say before it happened, and then you're just like, I've said this all year. I hope it doesn't blow up, because then you can never really make those comments again. Like, last time you said these were the two guys you had to have, and it was so clear, and it was going to be clear at every point, like you were wrong.
Yeah.
But I don't think that 2025 has that, at least not to that extent. And so again, we're dealing with a different
Right.
environment. You've got to play the year that you're in.
Yeah. Well, first off, it really reminds me of whenever I was at Number Fire. Back in the day, we would always do, like a yesterday's optimal DFS lineup, right? And we would just run an algorithm to show what the optimal DFS lineup was. And it was always like, in hindsight, it's very easy to see who those players would be, but you're never playing those players in that combination, right? And I feel similarly, you look at last year, like we were on, a Jaden Daniels, for instance, like he was one of the most obvious late round quarterbacks that you could have gone for, because we know, quarterback has gotten to this process point of like, we generally know what we're looking for, and the market has started to notice and know what we should be looking for. I always say that Lamar Jackson's first MVP season was sort of like like we need these like mobile guys who could also, and then obviously we've been introduced then to Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen and these unicorns who can just do everything. And the weird thing that's gone through my head is it's almost like the one meme where it's like the parabola of you have like the really basic thinker, and then you have like the nerd who's like really thinking about stuff more deeply, and then the final it just goes back to, it's like the person who solved everything, and it just goes back to how that original person was thinking. And I almost feel like that in fantasy football right now, where the original basic thinker is the lineup filler, right? It's the person who is just drafting based on, oh, I need 2 running backs, I need 3 wide receivers, I need a tight end and a quarterback. And so I'm fine with taking a tight end in round 2, and then I'm fine with taking a quarterback in round 3, because I'm just going to fill this lineup. When like the basis of like the late round quarterback, whenever I came out with that ebook and stuff, was literally the opposite of that. It was the idea that there is all this volatility, there is all of this variance, and we need to play into that and understand that that exists. And there's no reason when you can, because of the supply and demand side of things, there's no reason to reach for a quarterback when there's volatility with how they finish. And you can get a guy in round 11, round 12, who is going to perform just as well as the guys who are being drafted in round 1 at that point, round 1 and round 2. And so I think like what I've seen, like what I've thought about is, number one, like we right now have very segmented onesie positions where tight end is very obvious who the top tight ends are in fantasy football right now. And like I did an episode on, I don't like the name of it because I just couldn't, it was more of a clickbait name of the tight end dead zone, right? But it was basically the idea that if you look at the last 10 years of data and you look at tight end 7 to tight end 18, there is quite literally zero correlation between where those tight ends have been drafted and how many points per game they actually score. And, obviously you're going to get Brock Bowers, who skews it a little bit because he's tight end 10 or whatever last season. And then you're going to get guys who are in that tight end 7 range who are more floor, not ceiling. And so essentially there's just been no correlation. You could just grab someone out of a hat and that player has just as good of odds to finish high as someone who was drafted way higher than them. And, but right now we have like that jumble, right, of players that you can be higher or lower. Like, I'm not saying that you just avoid it no matter what, but we feel a lot better about Trey McBride, Brock Bowers, and George Kittle than we're going to feel about pretty much everyone else at that position. And so that's segmented, right? And then at quarterback, I mean, my angle at quarterback, like there's still people coming at me being like, oh, late round quarterback isn't a great strategy this year. I'm like, bro, I haven't been saying that. I haven't said that that's the go-to strategy for years now, because the market has adjusted and changed. And when you look at when people draft based on VORP and only VORP, they might see, Josh Allen gives you X number of points better than whatever running back would be drafted in that range. Let's say it's Breece Hall, or, Lamar Jackson will give you X number of points better than Marvin Harrison Jr. would versus his baseline. The thing that still does not get enough attention is the fact that we know who these quarterbacks are going to be, right? Like, we just talked about how we have no idea what Marvin Harrison Jr., like we could easily see George Pickens, if not projecting, we could see Pickens just outscoring Marvin Harrison Jr., and you're getting him 2 rounds later. Whereas when we say that at quarterback, we're not saying that for anyone outside the top 4. I mean, maybe people really like Joe Burrow, but I'm not in that camp. Maybe you are. But regardless, like, you're not looking at a quarterback going in round 7 and saying confidently the same way that you're saying it with George Pickens to Marvin Harrison Jr., or, insert round 5 wide receiver here. You're not saying it nearly as confidently when you look at a matchup that way. And so I've actually gone through the exercise quite often in the shower, a lot of times, of me thinking through, like, what if that really basic way of playing fantasy football, of lineup filling, is actually the way that we should be doing things this year? And, I think that a lot of times people are afraid of going double onesie in the first 5 rounds of their draft, because we know intuitively that running back and wide receiver matter way more than the other positions do, because you're starting more of them. But I do think we're at a spot right now where the ADP of wide receiver, of wide receiver 18 to wide receiver 42 or something like that, I think the right wide receivers are in there. But you're right, where it's some of it's just jumbled around, and I can make arguments for guys who are going 2 or 3 rounds later than other guys over those players, right? And so why would I not take advantage of that, as opposed to just being very strict with the way that ADP has historically fallen, and approaching things that way? Now, I'll ask you if you are seeing things similarly, but also I would imagine that it's easier to go about drafts in that manner when you are in a 10-team league, when you are in a more casual league, a home league, where it's going to be easier to make up for that opportunity cost, that you've incurred by going with an early round tight end and quarterback. But do you think it's viable this year, even in a relative, we're about to enter the Apex League, which, by the way, the last couple of years in the Apex League, I've been drafting early round quarterbacks. I had Josh Allen, I think, last year, and it's to me, it's gone way too far because of the predictability of those positions. So do you think it's viable to go double onesie like that? That's my first question. And then, do you think that it's viable across any kind of league that you're in?
The different formats are so interesting, in part because the environment is just so completely different.
Mm-hmm.
If you were playing a home league, not only can you, but you absolutely should
Yeah.
you probably want to try and get the cheapest of the elite QBs so that it doesn't wipe out maybe your first round pick. The same thing with Brock Bowers versus Trey McBride. I think that on the tight ends, there are 4 to me that you really probably want to build your team around. You were mentioning sort of the tight end zone. That was something that was not obviously, it was something that was always very, very clear from the great tools that Mike Beers built for us, where you can see the win rates by position. You can look at it from round, but you can look at it just the heat maps that he was able to pull together and show that drafting basically non-elite tight ends crushed you. It wasn't that it couldn't possibly work, but over time, the general results were absolutely terrible. And so when people push back against elite tight end, you need to, again, play every season for the season that you're in. You shouldn't look at a season where Sam Laporta is extremely expensive and has a terrible team context for being a truly elite scorer. You shouldn't look at a season where Travis Kelce, who, again, he's one of these players like these running backs, right, where people are saying, okay, well, you said he was going to slow down. You said he was going to slow down. You were wrong. I'm no longer scared of Travis Kelce. Well, you can continue to ignore the red flags, but he's falling off a cliff. He's not going to come and do the same thing for you. You can look at some similar things with Mark Andrews and the situation that he was in, and then fail to see that George Kittle is basically Mark Andrews, maybe better at a pretty big discount. Fail to see that Trey McBride has had this huge breakout, and that not only it's not only a good pick in isolation, but it's also basically your chance to play off of and to short Marvin Harrison's absurd ADP.
Yeah.
And then look at Brock Bowers as the greatest tight end prospect of all time. You can look at that and say, well, maybe the more expensive. And then I got Dalton Kincaid wrong. And so obviously you can make mistakes.
Sure.
But you look at that and you look at the different guys within that group, you still have to do your own evaluation and you still have to try and understand the season that you're in. To me, last year's failure of some elite tight ends was very obvious that was going to happen, but that the elite tight ends who were in great situations and were breakout players were going to crush, and that you had to have them.
Yeah.
And the fact that
Yeah.
they were cheaper, that you got these
Right.
great prices on guys like Kittle and Bowers, meant that you had to have them in basically every league. For me, the guys who are kind of priced like that now are Laporta and Hawkinson.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the guys like Bowers and McBride who don't have the same concerns that Kelsey and Laporta had at the top prices last year. So Kittle is awesome. He'll probably be fine. It's one of those things where anytime with 49ers, I think that when you have this efficiency element to it, take them when they're cheap and people seem concerned about that, and maybe fade them a little bit when they get expensive and you're increasing your risk. And then obviously Kelsey has collapsed. You probably shouldn't take it. But so you look at these other 4 tight ends, right? And the situation with their scoring to the price is fantastic. In your home league, you should have one of those 4 guys. It completely changes your starting lineup. The same thing with the QBs. And the thing there that makes it so you have almost no risk is that in home leagues, the ADP that you draft with originally and then how people tend to approach waivers means that you just have no scarcity at running back or wide receiver. Now, that becomes even more the case if you have shallower starting lineups. It is even more the case if you have shallower benches, but it's basically the case regardless, right? That if you do a good job of drafting and you understand the profiles of guys who are likely to break out, those players are cheap to free in home leagues. You're going to make sure that you get all of those guys, so that once you've drafted the early QB, you've drafted the early tight end, you still want to score at the other positions, but it's so easy to do.
Right.
That's much less, much more difficult to do. It's less of a clear-cut path in, say, an FFPC main event or an Apex league. You're going to really struggle to do the same type of thing, which doesn't mean it's not still the play, but it is a different environment in which to do it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's going to be more difficult. The only thing that I'll say about like Apex, for instance, like FFPC won't be this way, but like an Apex draft, like the reason that I've gotten a Josh Allen, for instance, like the last couple of years, like I think I might have had Hurts 2 years ago and I had Allen last year, is because they've fallen to round 5. You know, like it's you're getting a 2-round discount often on those kinds of players. So I think that if you're in a league where it is sharp and people are rightfully going after wide receivers and running backs at a pretty high clip, you know, that also could turn around into your favor, and you could go with one of those really predictable onesies because their cost has fallen, and you get to a point where the opportunity cost realistically, you know, if you're in round 5, and sure, I'm probably revealing too much to the person that's drafting right next to me in this draft that starts on Friday, but if we're fortunately round 5, I'll be picking right before you. So if Josh Allen's still on the board, just get ready for me to take Josh Allen. But if
Reggie's got on the sheet, who do you want to come out of every draft with? And I'm like I'm going to tell you.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so, I do think that obviously it's going to be draft dependent, but I think that people, because I think the safest sort of bet and approach has historically been to not overload the onesie positions. Like it's just been that way since we started analyzing this stuff and to, started voicing our opinions on this game. It's been a fairly obvious way. I'm not saying like, don't, never get an elite tight end, never get an elite quarterback. I'm saying doubling up is not an easy thing to take on from an opportunity cost perspective. But I think that of all years that I've seen from just like the way the ADP is laid out, it does feel most comfortable doing that this year, especially like in certain pockets of your draft. Like I personally have actually, and I know that I took Brock Bowers in the MFL 10 of death, but I actually have an easier time drafting Trey McBride than I do Bowers in a non-tight end premium format because of the opportunity cost side. Because because where Brock Bowers goes, generally, you're going to have to take him over really, really elite wide receivers. And it's really, really difficult to do that, right? But then where McBride goes, that's where you're starting to get into the Marvin Harrison Jr. opportunity cost. And to me, that's the difference in exposure for me, right now, where I'm at like 20% McBride and I'm at like, 11% Bowers, let's say. It's or 10%. It's all because of that opportunity cost. So I think that like it's real. I think that the overall theme of what we're saying here, or at least what I'm trying to communicate, is to understand the pockets of your draft and where things do get really flat, and recognize that like, this is partially why I wanted to get away from talking about the running back dead zone the way that we've always talked about the running back dead zone, because at the end of the day, it really is more of an archetype zone. It just so happens that a lot of those types of backs are just going in the same area of drafts year in and year out. So it's a very easy shorthand way for us to discuss that. But realistically, like you said, you could argue that there's sort of a wide receiver dead zone this year where people are kind of forcing the issue because they know they need wide receiver and they're like, oh crap, I missed out on these elite guys. So now I got to push it a little bit and get these inferior talents or inferior players who aren't in that great of situations when I realistically can get that same player 2 rounds later. Take advantage of that. Like use that to your advantage and say, okay, I'll throw a dart and take a chance on Amari and Hampton, or I'll take a chance on an elite quarterback, or I'll take a chance on, maybe McBride falls or whomever. I think that is sort of the way that I've viewed things, this season. And it's just forced me to think about that doubling up the onesie positions and such. This episode is sponsored by DraftKings. There's no better way to lock in your fantasy dominance early than with Best Ball on DraftKings, where you draft once and ride your roster all season long. And right now, DraftKings is giving all customers a can't-miss offer. Draft one, get one. Enter a lineup in the $15 million Best Ball contest for just $20, and you'll score another Best Ball ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million, giving you a second shot to win big. It's easy. Just draft your dream team once, no weekly management required, and let your top scorers automatically start each week. Across the whole season, every breakout star, every clutch play, every touchdown will count towards your quest for a share of $15 million. I'm drafting over there all the time. It's an absolute blast. So download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app now to draft your $20 Best Ball lineup to play for a share of $15 million and get a second ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million. That's 2 chances to win big without ever setting your lineup again. Draft one, get one, only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY to 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. 1 per customer. Enter the Best Ball $15 million headliner contest by 9/4/25 to get 1 bonus entry. $20 entry fee required. Reward expires in 30 days. See terms at DraftKings.com/NFL-best-ball. Sponsored by DK. Now back to the show. When you think about how ADP looks right now, and us discussing it in this way, do you think the fantasy football market has gotten sharper? And then kind of on top of that, has that affected the way that you've approached the game from a game theory perspective and like an archetype drafting perspective? Like I just talked about the running back dead zone and how that seems to have at least shifted a little bit. And, right now it's kind of difficult to know exactly how drafts are formulated because so many of us are playing best ball and it's just a different game and people are drafting differently than they will in a home league or even in an FFPC type environment. But like other things are happening right now where like rookies might be going a little bit earlier. Like, does that make you not want to throw darts at rookies? Is the market, in your opinion, getting sharper? And if it is getting sharper, is that switching and changing the way that you're approaching drafts from an archetype standpoint?
So I think there are 3 big ways in which drafts have gotten sharper, or the community has gotten better at fantasy. And those would be, the big one is just basically giving up on this idea that running back scarcity means that you should draft all of the running backs at the beginning of drafts, and failing to understand both the contingency based aspect to a lot of running back scoring, which was kind of the crucial and most important point right from the beginning, and then also the scoring is what matters. And the flex position, and certainly if you have flex positions, that those are real positions that you have to treat again from a perspective of scoring matters.
Mm-hmm.
That has changed ADP pretty dramatically, and I think that you could argue that it's made fantasy sharper in that it's taken away some very obvious structural approaches that were pretty dominant. And so we had the conversation about zero RB earlier. I would say that I think that it has taken that away, at least for 2025 in redraft, which, I mean, when you have your brand connected to something, you can look at it in a variety of ways. But in many ways, I think it's a relief. And it's something that's fantastic about drafting because it makes drafts a lot more fun. You have a lot more that you can do. And you also, I think, now have more ways to actually beat the field because you're not as limited to a dominant structure that, yeah, doing something that's dominant is always very helpful, but it does impose some limitations on you that maybe hurt you as a drafter or at least weren't fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so even though fantasy has gotten sharper from that perspective, I think in some ways it actually makes it easier in that now there's potentially more separation between good drafters and simply drafters who understood that, yeah, I probably should do a zero RB-ish type of approach. You now have a bigger gap if you do more things well, potentially. The other thing that I think, and I said there were three, but there are just so many different offshoots of all these different pieces. I think that drafters are more willing now to emphasize talent. And I think that that is huge.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't think it's very efficiently applied. I think that we have a tendency to want shortcuts and to strip away context and believe that there are like the best stat of this or the best stat of that. And if my guy is doing well in this, and if the cohort for this supposedly does a certain thing, that I can feel a lot of confidence and I can strip away a lot of other context and not worry about that. I can potentially strip away previous seasons and not worry about that. One of the things that I thought was really strange, and again, human nature is to point out the ones where you were right, and I'm wrong all the time. So I just want to stipulate that as well.
Sure.
One of the things that I thought was weird last season is there was so much concern about Jackson Smith and Jigba because of certain stats that he'd put up as a rookie that were not ideal.
Yeah.
Failing to look at what the context was in terms of coordinator play, what the context was in terms of dealing with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, and failing to understand who he was as a prospect. And this kind of goes back to kind of the brief digression I had earlier, where suggesting that draft position gives us so much information on prospects, but it also informs ADP to such an extent that your edge is actually understanding where draft position misleads you on a player. It's not in understanding what draft position tells you, because that's priced in. You have to understand the places where it's misleading. And so if you have some of those elements, certainly you can also debate the JSN profile. There were some weaknesses to it, but there were also extraordinary things about it.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, I'm very willing to bet on this guy in year two, especially with the price. I mean, the Harrison one is interesting because there were actually some red flags in his profile that people didn't give enough weight to, and certainly weren't the most salient thing about him by any stretch. But there were some red flags, and even with those red flags then manifesting at the NFL level, his price is still pretty hot again. Now, that's not to say that someone with the background that Marvin Harrison has couldn't blow up in year two, because he definitely could.
Sure.
But I would say that I don't necessarily... So I think because people are more willing to emphasize talent and because we do have a lot of information and we do understand generally how good individual stats are, we get overconfident and we lose track of important context. Blair does a bunch of great articles every year, sort of gently pointing out that a lot of the superstar stats or the best stat of this or the best stat of that perform worse than just fantasy points.
Mm.
And, that's not always great for someone trying to sell
For
like
our
deep
job.
fantasy analysis, right? But
Yeah.
but it is actually valuable to have someone come back and say, look, I mean, understand the entire context. But so it's not even necessarily a matter of not understanding the context, but it is something where you get overconfident and then
Yeah.
you don't price scenarios very well. And
Yeah.
when I look at the 2025 ADP, I'm kind of like, I'm probably just missing information because JJ, as you know, I have a process that is somewhat cloistered, but and so I always kind of try and approach it from the humility perspective myself. Where like, it's probably just that I don't know things and I'm wrong.
Yeah. That's what, yeah.
But
I
when
do.
I look
Yeah.
at ADP, but
Yeah.
when I look at ADP, I'm like, I don't think the scenarios for just so many players are priced correctly. And if the
Yeah.
scenarios are not priced correctly, then ADP is still pretty exploitable. And so, yeah, fantasy has evolved so much. It's gotten so much better. It's gotten so much more interesting. It's always been interesting, but the wealth of information that we have is so much in 2020. And yet, I think that even though we've journeyed down this path, if you're looking at a fantasy redraft league of all types and trying to decide should I play it like does AI and does do Sims and all these great stats, does that make it something where it's not really beatable? I should just draft ADP. People telling me ADP value is all that matters. I would push back against that and say no. I mean, if anything, you have as good or better chance to beat your league mates in 2025 than you've ever had.
I love the point about the lack of context. Like if you were to just dumb this down into a really simple idea, I think that it would be that. It's that like we see these skeleton key analyses all the time with fantasy that if this guy does not hit this threshold, like there's no nuance to some of that. Like, JSN's rookie season, even like Roma Dunze last year, right? Where he has a really awful season peripheral wise, and everything that we would look at analytically and statistically, we'd say this is a red flag with a Dunze. And my approach, I did an entire episode on this, and people were angry at me for it because they thought that it was me just complaining. Because I talked about I did a reroll trade in a dynasty league this offseason where I did let go of a Dunze because his dynasty price was just really, really high at this point. And I took on, I think, the 108, and it was Emeka Egbuka was my worst case scenario, right? And to me, I saw them as comparable prospects, but we had a situation where we already had a season of Adunze not necessarily living up to quite the hype. And so the idea was, okay, well, maybe I'm certainly open to the possibility of like, we know the situation was bad, but it's just this binary thinking that people have all the time of like, now I'm the guy who thinks that Adunze is really bad, but I think Adunze is a decent redraft target just because the cost is different, right? Everything comes down to that factor. But there's two examples, I think. Actually, I'll just go with one of them that I think is really, really important here. So a lot of times, like I'll dig up some sort of data point or something that I see as predictive, and a lot of the stuff that I do is based off of ADP analysis, because a lot of times the data, the points, and you talked about like Blair talking about like points per game and stuff being like, that's all you got to look at. Like that's the thing to go to whenever you're trying to predict how well a player is going to do in a future season. The thing that I think gets lost too is that people aren't layering on cost to any of that kind of analysis oftentimes. And so they're saying, hey, look, this guy, anyone who has a 2.5 yards per out run or better one season is automatically going to have a great season the next year. But what if that guy is being drafted 103 and he does, there's other things going on with that player's profile that dictates and says that he's not a 103 player. Just because he hit that mark doesn't mean that we automatically need to be drafting him, because there's a cost element to this that is everything. Like that's literally what drives draft strategy and drives all the work that we're doing is cost at the end of the day. And so when I go and I do like my draft guide, for instance, I'm looking at previous season numbers and I'm trying to see what's predictive and what's not. It's all in relation to a player's cost. And so I'll try to bucket players in these different areas of the draft to say, okay, when you're in like wide receiver, 19 to 42 range, like this is what you're looking for, but it's a little bit different than what we're looking for like top 18 wide receivers and so on and so forth. And the one example of that this year was at the running back position. We know that target share is just unbelievably important at running back, right? Like we want pass catching running backs. And that's been the case forever. And still the market tends to undervalue pass catching running backs for whatever reason, but we'll take it, right? Like we'll take all the edges that we can get.
Barkley Price is weird coming off of what he did last year, where
yeah,
I mean he's a faller in some formats, which is interesting.
It is. And so we know that pass catching, generally speaking, is something that people even when you go and you look at, and I want to ask you about this too, you go and look at like beat reports right now about like the Jacksonville backfield, the Minnesota backfield, and or the Jets backfield. Maybe the Jets is a even better example. I have nothing against Tank Bigsby, Jordan Mason, and Braylon Allen, but when it's discussed, it's always like, this is a split backfield. It's going to be a 45-55 split. It's going to be a 50-50 split, whatever that split is. But that's not really what we care about in fantasy football at the end of the day. Like we're much more concerned about the pass catching stuff and to a degree the goal line stuff, right? Like the important touches that these guys are going to have. And so when I looked at running backs this offseason, I know that target share is so important. I said to myself, well, what we need to at least try to predict target share to some stronger degree than just saying like this guy had a good receiving profile in college and we like him. We know that he can catch passes. And so the one thing that actually got a lot of signal versus ADP and versus cost was yards per out run, previous season yards per out run at running back. Obviously we're looking at it at wide receiver all the time, but at running back too. And there are certain thresholds where when like middle round running backs are below like a 0.7-ish yards per out run from the previous season, they've never, at least in the, it's not as, I mean, it's like 26 to 30 running backs or so since 2014 is when the data dates back to. They've never had a double-digit percentage target share the following season, even if they had a double-digit percentage target share in the current season. Now, and then the inverse is true, where players who had really, really, really strong yards per out run rates, they tend to have stickier target shares year over year and be able to maintain really high target shares. Now, it's funny because then I dug into it, and one of the players that had a really high yards per out run rate last year at running back, who's now in the middle rounds, is David Montgomery. And so I can't sit here and say, go draft David Montgomery because he's going to catch a lot of passes this year, because obviously Jahmyr Gibbs is in that backfield with him, right? So like,
it's one of the weird things that really does jump out is Montgomery's receiving last year is right? One of the strangest stats that we have in all of fantasy.
Yeah, it was really, really weird. And so like, but like we have to obviously bring that in and bring the context in. The other one was Chuba Hubbard on the other end, right? Chuba Hubbard had, and this is not this is a pretty consistent thing throughout his career so far, is that he's not been a very efficient receiver, per route run. And he's not seen, last year he had a spike in target share, at like 12, a little over 12%. But when you then give it the context and say, like, I'm not trying to stop there, right? I think a lot of people see a data point and then they stop and they say, okay, fade or target, right? Just based on this data point. But to me, there are other things that add up to Chuba Hubbard probably seeing a decline in target share year over year, which is they added Rico Dowdle to the backfield, which they didn't have any competition for. I mean, they had Jonathan Brooks, obviously, which didn't work out. But they add Rico Dowdle to the backfield, and they also drafted Trevor Etienne, who is purely a pass. Like that is what he did in college, and that he is a receiving back. And so to me, it's this merging of the data points that that you're referring to that a lot of people that like lack the context with, but then adding sort of the story and the GM moves and the team actual interactions in the draft and what they might have been thinking with the draft and like all of those layers to create the story about that player in a way. And so like, yeah, I've been really low on Chuba Hubbard this year versus the market, but it's based off of not just the data point of me being fearful of what that receiving workload might look like. And for the record, they have a great schedule to start the year. So when he dominates the first month of the season, please don't at me about Chuba. But To me, that's what it's all about, is like giving it that type of context. Like, are there any players who come to mind for you? And maybe I could associate this with another question I wanted to ask you, because I look at wide receiver, like we talked about, in that like wide receiver 20 to wide receiver 40 range. And while we can see, like, I'll have wide receivers that are 5 or 6 wide receiver spots different from ADP, but all of the players in that range are generally in that range for me. But are there any general fades in that area? And do you think some of this thinking is the reason why their ADP is where it's at?
I think some of it is that. Some of it is a willingness to lean on the background in a way that I think is good in general, but it's also a question of what is your ceiling and what have these guys demonstrated in terms of the ability, to really emerge as a star, and then what is the context again as it relates to pricing scenarios, right? So you look at DK Metcalf and you have someone who really struggled down the stretch last year. Now, part of that is probably playing at less than 100%. But you got a guy who is not a big target earner. He's not a big ball in hand guy. And the offensive context there in Pittsburgh could be really bad. And so I think that one of the things that we have to kind of balance on some of the offenses, and it's something that you kind of have to work with on JSN as well, is that yes, the target competition is very minimal, and yet if the offense has no ceiling, then you're going to have this counterbalancing type of effect. I'm not, guess, more concerned about an offense that's coordinated by Arthur Smith. One of the things too is, you have these sort of run oriented teams, right? And we think about context and you think about, okay, we have the Caleb Johnson price, you have the Jalen Warren price. It's interesting to debate those guys against each other, even though they're 2 rounds apart. But there's also just the element that even though this offense is supposedly run based, it's very bad for running back scoring.
Mm.
And so how good would you actually have to be if you're either of those guys to both convincingly defeat the other player and still be able to flourish within an offense that does weird things to destroy fantasy scoring? So I think
Right.
with DK Metcalf at wide receiver 20, and my understanding is that the reports out of camp are not good for Aaron Rodgers, which is always one of those things where you look at it and you're like, maybe a Hall of Fame MVP type of player could get kind of that final gasp, could be in a little bit better situation. You play for a team like the Steelers where organizationally they're very strong, and you get this. It's not really obviously a dead cat bounce, but you get some little boost at the end, but that's not reportedly what we're getting. I mean,
Yeah.
DK Metcalf at his price is really weird to me because you have mostly downside. You can look at someone who is a little bit different than that in Terry McLaurin, who's someone who's coming off of a career year, and yet we still have that issue of not being an elite target earner, having this sort of extended track record, which is again the thing for Metcalf, where an extended track record in the early career suggested a secondary breakout, but that faded and he sort
Yeah.
of reestablished where he was at a much lower level and certainly a much lower ceiling type of thing. With McLaurin, you're kind of counting on just how good Jaden Daniels is. You're counting on those touchdowns. You have the uncertainty. It's surprising to me that he hasn't been punished more for some of the context here. Now, we're still pretty early, and so I think a lot of
Yeah.
drafters are thinking this is going to work out fine.
Yeah.
And, you're thinking about, well, when Jamar Chase got punished some last year,
Yeah.
he had one of the greatest seasons of all time, so we
Yeah.
should throw that out the window. It's like, again, we shouldn't pattern match to something that is pretty unique there. It
Yeah.
does create additional concern because McLaurin's ADP was already hot, right?
Right.
And then you
Right.
have someone like DJ Moore, who's in many ways the opposite. He is a big target guy. He is a ball in hand guy. But like the strengths that he has, they also have contextual elements that they've added that are a big problem, which
Mm-hmm.
is that if you are a ball in hand guy and they've added Luther Burden, that's potentially catastrophic.
Right.
Right. If you are a big target guy and now your team is the deepest team in terms of skill position talent, at least at the receiving positions, maybe in the entire NFL, even with uncertainty, and really with DJ Moore, with how poorly he played last year, it's sort of funny. They're very different profiles in some ways, but the Keenan Allen thing, I've had Keenan Allen ranked for most of the offseason and mostly ranked way ahead of where he's been drafted. It's like he's eventually going to sign, right? And 2 years ago, he was absolutely awesome. Last year, he was more or less the same as DJ Moore and Rome Odunze. Now, because of trajectory, because of where people are in their careers, there are big differences in these guys.
Sure. Yeah.
And the old guy is never appealing as like, I want to build my team around the old guy.
Sure.
And at the same time, the scenarios for all three players are priced incorrectly. So at the different prices, maybe you just, draft a Keenan Allen. But so for DJ Moore, you have more things that he does well. You have more ways to win, but you also have more ceiling paths just closed off by, again, the context.
Yeah.
I don't understand why those three guys are going where they're going, other than you have a decent track record for them. And that decent track record, when you have the best ball ADP that then washes down through everything else, and people are saying, okay, Terry McLaurin, especially those touchdowns are going to be very valuable in best ball where you just get them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
In a redraft situation, you probably would just prefer to start someone who's going to score more points for the full season than Terry McLaurin and doesn't have all of these red flags. So I think you can go through that. And there are players who are being drafted just after in McMillan and Pickens and Jameson Williams. Devontae Smith is weird to me, where he's got this just horrible, horrible context. And yet his talent is such that he's outscored that context relative to price. So
yes,
I always kind of second guess my own calibration, and I want to keep looking at these guys. I'm like, Shawn, are you just addicted to the more fun players and you're drafting them specifically because of that, and you are willing to set aside actual scoring? And so you always want to go back through, look at those things, try and figure out where guys are, figure out how the scenarios are being priced. But even when I try and second guess myself on a lot of these players, I don't understand. And I mean, Mike Evans at wide receiver 18 is utterly bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we work through that and you look at track record and context, but also understanding what it means that a guy has been this throughout his career, and then if you add bad context on top of it and you're trying to win your league or stack potential league winning outcomes as you go through your individual picks, those players at those prices, it's not even necessarily something where you're saying, okay, I definitely have to pull up George Pickens, or I'm going to pull up Jameson Williams, or I'm just going to say, yeah, Javonte Williams is in this offense that is catastrophic for his scoring, but he still scores, so I'm going to pick him. You can pick a different position.
Yeah. No, I like those call outs a lot. There's also sometimes like DJ Moore is someone who I haven't drafted a lot of from a best ball perspective. And I'm probably at 4% maybe at this point. And I have a decent amount of Rome Odunze. And a lot of it for me is as simple as what you said. Is what he's doing on a football field like replicable by another player on this team? And I think Odunze is the one player on that team this year that at least has the more individualized skill set that is not easy to duplicate. Whereas, Burden was someone that a lot of people, even my prospect model, comped to DJ Moore, or had DJ Moore as a comp, right? And so I'm not saying that they played the same. I know we're going to get back into the people yelling at me because Burden was much more of a gadgety, slot guy in college, and DJ Moore was not that. But when you look at size, when you look at general production profile, that sophomore year, especially with Burden, there was a decent amount of overlap just in the stuff that I'm looking at with like my breakout score metric and stuff. And so I think it's a really, really important exercise to go through, and why I feel similarly as you do. Like the round 4 wide receivers, I'm just not that keen in going after them when you get the George Pickens, Devontae Smiths after them, even like a Teteroa McMillan, who has a really interesting upside case as a rookie. It's harder to go after some of those players. I do want to ask one more question before I let you go. And it's about coach speak and about sort of what we see with reporting right now and what you hear in the media. I'm curious how you approach, what you read this time of year, if you care at all about what you're reading, and how you sort of internalize that and then use it and deploy it during a draft, and how you go about, like, for instance, Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt getting a ton of buzz right now, just an absurd amount of buzz. Or, you're seeing Torrey Horton right now getting love out of Seattle. These day 3 rookies where we know, the hit rates are supremely low for these kinds of players, but the hype is certainly there. And then, you can talk veterans too, but how much are you internalizing coach speak? Like, does it matter for your process, and how are you actually using that when you're drafting?
So one of the things that always jumps out to me, and I'm sure jumps out to you, is that coaches are very poorly calibrated on like how many plays there are in their offenses. And so you add up how they're supposedly going to use the players, and you're like, you're going to play 3 games every week. That's impressive.
Right.
Just in some cases would probably push back and be like, you understand that we're just talking to fans and reporters, and that we're keeping some of this a little closer to the vest.
Yeah.
But you also have poor calibration from the reporters covering the teams in terms of what's likely to happen based on off-season moves and how good the individual players on the teams they're covering are. And I don't mean that in a nasty way, like they don't know what they're talking about, because there are certainly tons of things that they know that I don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it does help you, I think, when you're filtering this information that's coming at you, to understand the profiles of the players coming out. And that's, I think, one of the areas that was kind of a sub point to a sub point in the earlier conversation we were having, which is I don't think that, in part because people like you are doing such great prospect research, and in part because it takes a lot of time to do everything yourself, I don't think that people have the context for the prospects either. And so it's very easy to grab onto certain specific things that this guy is good and this guy is not because they did a certain thing, as opposed to, now, I mean, you had a lot of great innovations with your stuff, and people are always mentioning your guide to me, which I think is really cool. But a lot of this stuff is going to be difficult to capture through models.
Yeah.
And I think that for someone who's dug into all of the information and then has a very dynamic model, you have both sides of it, where you did all of the research and you have the familiarity with the players, and then you have also what the analytics are telling you, and the combination of those things is just so potent.
Right.
But if you just have some of the key stats, then again, it's really tough to understand who players are as prospects. Now, I'm sure that there are people who are much, much better than I am at it, but going through the prospect of writing our guide each year in the recent past, and then some of the innovations back in the early part of RotoViz that guys like John Moore and obviously the Fantasy Douche did such an amazing job with, I feel like being familiar with prospects is helpful because you have more context for understanding how people are going to move through their early years. I mean, so much of beating fantasy is going to be beating the first year, the second year, the third year.
Right.
And then trying to resist holding on to guys too long. Your ability to beat, and I just mentioned a bunch of guys who actually in their peak-ish timeframes and say that you can beat those guys too. But fantasy is mostly about beating the two edges, right? The young players and the old players, not getting caught up in that. And having more information, digging into it more deeply is very helpful with that. And then you can process the coach speak a little bit better. You mentioned some of the stuff with the Jaguars. One of the things with the Jaguars that is pretty interesting, and Ben says this a lot on Stealing Bananas, but it's just that in some ways it can be scary when Tank Bigsby is supposedly having this great camp. But it's fantastic for Bashal Tutin that is the guy, because the scary person for Tutin would be ETN.
Exactly.
If ETN were playing well and seemed like he had the starting job, that would be a threat. The weird thing, and I took ETN in the MFL 10 of Death that we were talking about, I believe, in part because I was trying to balance some exposure, in part because, I mean, ETN is one of these guys who was just such a transcendent college player that in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking like maybe he could do the Saquon Barkley thing where you have
Yeah.
a lot of injuries and then you have some bad peripherals, but it turns out that what you are sometime deeper into your career is what you were a long time ago, and you're a
Yeah.
superstar. It doesn't seem like we're on that path with ETN. And if we're not, then the fact that Bashal Tutin is actually a much better prospect, I think, than people realize.
Hmm.
Sometimes if you were not trendy going into the combine and then you have a huge combine, people think that you're just that. And then as soon as you have any issues like a fumbling issue or you have a little bit of an injury thing, your coach is saying you need to pass block better. And people are like, oh, he's got all of these problems. It's like, no, the team knew all of those things. They're trying to
Right.
communicate to him that this is your way to get to be Jamal Charles. Not to
Yeah.
be like, this is why we're going to put you on the bench for the next 2 years. They want him to get
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
So when that
Yeah.
information filters out in the media, you have to understand the context of they're trying to let him know. He's got some funny quotes about like in college coming to the sideline and his coach being like, you got to finish these runs. And he's like, coach, they can't catch me. They're going to never catch me. Right. And, so at a certain point, and then the coach is like, yeah, he was right. They never caught him.
Yeah.
The NFL is going to be a little different, and there are going to be things you need to execute. And certainly you're going to need to not fumble. But Tutin is better than people realize. He's better than his. So it hits on these points where he's better than his draft slot by a ton.
Hmm.
And you work through that and you're like, this is a guy where I feel a lot of comfort kind of grabbing him up as he falls because,
Right.
yeah, maybe this is kind of going in a direction where he's not going to score a lot in weeks 1 and 2. But at the prices now, I don't need the week 1 and 2 scoring. He's probably going to score a ton at some point, and this fits perfectly. So the fall is
Yeah.
fine. There are going to be some other players where maybe you have some more questions yourself or you have questions about what the team thinks. And so some of those things, when you're getting some insights either from the coach himself or how practice is being reported, who is filtering in here. I mean, one of the things too with all of these depth chart reveals and even just like who's playing with the first team in this practice and this practice and this practice, it's not so much about necessarily who's playing with the first team or the second team, but if those things come as a surprise. If it's
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
point in time, like it's going to be a bigger problem for a veteran that you actually thought was going to score for you right away than for, maybe a day 2 rookie where you're like, yeah, I mean, I didn't think he was going to be with the first team now. And to a certain extent, I don't even want him to because I don't want his price to rise so much that he moves out of the range where I can get him.
Right.
And so it's going to come down to player by player in these individual situations of really trying to filter what you mentioned with price being just incredibly important for understanding how much you want to factor in certain, but not factor in, but just what the repercussions are. And
Right.
then also
Right.
just again, this element of you need to know the context. You need to know what you think about the player before you hear all of these reports so that you can balance those things. If you are setting yourself up entirely in terms of what you come down as your evaluation based on what a coach or a reporter is saying, then you don't have the other part of it, which is that context, that belief going in of who this guy is.
Yeah, I love that. I love that take. I mean, I kind of view it too, and I go back to like Puka Nacua when he came out, where I liked him right as a prospect. But I think there are parallels, and I'm not saying that this is the outcome that's going to happen for Torrey Horton at all, right? But there's parallels in the not even the profile. That's not, so I don't want people's brains to go in the wrong direction here. But there are parallels in the idea that I liked Torrey Horton more than where he ended up getting drafted, for instance, right? And I liked Puka Nacua more than where he ended up getting drafted. And then I hear that they're dominating because there was a drumbeat for Puka Nacua for like a month and a half. If you were, like Jordan Rodriguez was really on top of it that offseason with both him and Kyron Williams. And like Torrey Horton right now, there's enough of a drumbeat where there's a lot of favorable things coming out of Seattle where I'm like, look, my evaluation, I never in a million years expected Puka Nacua to be what he is, right? But that's not that doesn't matter. You only have to be a little bit better than your opponents in fantasy football. And all that means is, okay, I liked Torrey Horton more than the consensus. I recognize fully that a day 3 wide receiver generally is not going to hit. But when you combine these ideas of this player having a favorable profile with the stuff coming out of Seattle, that at least makes me interested in drafting him, right? And then there's the cost element where even like a Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt right now, who like for my stuff that I look at, I'm like, number one, he didn't even get a combine invite. So that's one hard thing to deal with whenever you're modeling and looking at things analytically. And there are some per rush stuff that I understand is looks favorable for him, but like there's a lot of red flags too. You know, like he's a 24-year-old rookie. Like there's stuff that's like, we're like, okay, like how many of these kinds of players have really hit in the past? And or Kyle Monangai, right? How many of these kinds of players have really hit in the past? And my answer though is I'll care when they have a real opportunity cost to their cost, right? Like even in the prospect guide, the later on prospect guide this year, when I did the Kyle Monangai write up, because we were all waiting for which running back is going to go to Chicago. Like we were all ready for it to be Travion and then Tootin and then, whether you're, I'm part of the conspiracy theory that thinks that they did want some of those pockets of running backs, but they just, they all went right before they ended up picking. But regardless, however we were all excited about the Chicago running back, and then they get Kyle Monangai, who did not check most of the boxes that I care about for a fantasy football running back, right? But even in the draft guide or the prospect guide, my thinking was people are going to buy into this just because of the situation, when the player himself, in my opinion, is not really like that special. Maybe he could give you like an RB3 type season, but like he's not a truly, truly special talent, in my opinion, based on my analysis. But that didn't really happen from like a rookie draft perspective. And it's not really happening from a best ball or season long perspective. You're still getting him in the final rounds of drafts. So why would I care? You know, like it just doesn't matter. If there's going to be steam, I can buy into that when it just doesn't matter enough. The cost would be that you're using a roster spot on that player, of course, right? I think it's a lot easier to lean into that in a managed league where you're running the waiver wire and you're able to drop the guy if, you know, he doesn't show anything, that kind of thing. But at the same time, when the cost is not increasing based on the reports, it's a lot easier to buy into and stuff. The harder part is what we were just talking about with Jacksonville, is when Tank Bigsby, who, I mean, for all intents and purposes, is not going to be a supreme pass catcher at the NFL level, right? Like there's been now multiple seasons where that's not been the case. He was fine from a volume perspective in college as a pass catcher, but even his peripherals were pretty average to below average. And we now, we saw him the first 2 years in the NFL. Chances are that's not going to be his role. And so we know that we will buy into the steam to a certain point, and then the cost gets too high and we say, look, we don't need to buy into this right now, because we know what wins and what works at the end of the day in fantasy football. So I love the answer, and hopefully people are able to take something away from that whole discussion with coach speak and stuff. I think it's important. Like, I don't think it's nothing. You know, I think that it's something that we should be internalizing. It's just so easy to see, like, you can see it on social media. And I know Shawn, for the record, is one of the smart ones who's gotten off of social media, but I see it on social media where people who don't even do prospect evaluation, which is fine. I'm not expecting you to do prospect evaluation, but everything hinges off of the beat reports. Everything hinges off of what you're reading in practice, when there's a lot more that goes into that kind of thing.
And those are definitely some interesting. The thing with Jalen Royals, I think, is very interesting, and that a lot of people want to throw him to the side because of where he was drafted, and because the day 3 hits. In a similar type of thing with the Torrey Horton. And my point is just that the reason that there are very few day 3 hits at wide receiver is that teams should not be drafting receivers on day 3 in almost any cases, because basically everyone who has been drafted on day 3 is a non-prospect. But if you go and look at the players who would have the prospect profile to be drafted earlier, and it's interesting in terms of some of these guys being small school guys as well, where you have guys who maybe had the prospect profile, and you know that it's less clear if they played at a lower level. But the hit rate, while still not like glowing, it's just very different if you pull out only the players who were good in college.
Yeah.
Right. And so that part is interesting. And I mean, Torrey Horton, it always cracks me up, like Jaden Blue. My understanding is, rerunning the 40, even though he crushed the combine, because he's like, I'm a little bit faster. I can show you I'm even faster. Yeah. And Torrey Horton is like, I'm a fantastic athlete, but you need to know that I was like 75% during all that stuff. Like Torrey Horton thinks that he's a superstar. which,
Yeah.
I mean, it is kind of helpful for that guy
Yeah.
to also think he's good. It's probably mostly relevant for Cooper Kupp, right? Which is another somewhat weird
Mhm.
wide receiver price.
Yeah. Yeah, for
Even
sure. I mean, Torrey
even
Horton.
if you're saying that these guys aren't going to use the same way, it's still relevant
Right.
for the guy who is a declining player.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's 100% target share pie, right? I mean, like that's it, if it declines because another guy's good, then that's going to hurt the player that it would be declining for. Yeah, the Torrey Horton thing's crazy too because he was hurt last year. I think it was a foot injury, right? And he like no one really expected him to do anything at the combine, and then he did, and he tested well, and he still thinks he can. Like there's still more there potentially, which is why of all the sort of like player, and Jalen Royals is really interesting. I agree because his top one of his top comps in my prospect model was Rashee Rice, and so to see that connection, makes it more obvious to be like, yeah, let's throw that dart. But with Torrey Horton, like of all the day 3 players, he's probably the one where it's like, okay, there's this injury and he didn't get any production his final year, so from a modeling standpoint, it's not really counting that final season. It's only hurting him because the season was kind of a wash. And so of all these wide receivers, like I really, and I know that this seems like it's in hindsight, but like, I'm not overly shocked that it would be like, this is the dude who's getting, the most love out of camp right now. So definitely a name that I think folks should be at least paying attention to. Maybe waiver wire guy, most home leagues, you don't need to draft Torrey Horton more than likely, but definitely pay attention to it. But Shawn, I appreciate the time. This was such an awesome conversation. I always love sitting down and chopping it up with you. Let everyone know what you're working on, where they can find you, because you guys are doing some awesome stuff right now.
Yeah, so I have lots of different deep dive-ish articles coming out, trying to provide some of this context and look at players from a variety of different perspectives. Layer upon layer upon layer for the guys. Had a big Kansas City Chiefs piece. Obviously, they are pretty controversial or interesting for a team that's been to so many Super Bowls that so many things could happen with them. JSN, somebody we talked about a little bit today. Kevin's doing great stuff over there for us. Everyone knows Blair. Having a lot of fun on Stealing Bananas. Thanks for mentioning that. And then Colin Kelly and I. Colin's doing his own show. It's been fantastic. And then we have RotoViz Overtime together. Yeah, we'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz.
Yeah, definitely check them out. And look, I have to shout out too that RotoViz is a legitimate OG from a like I started prospecting probably 2017, 2018, and it doesn't happen without the work that RotoViz did originally with a lot of this stuff. And it needs to be shouted out. And I try to give, love to that. I think even in the prospect guide, whenever I talk about the modeling and like understanding what metrics work and what don't, I think that the baseline, if you will, it's sort of like with Joe Bryant and value-based drafting, where it's a VORP strategy that everyone kind of has built off of in a way. I feel similarly about RotoViz and all the work that you guys have done with prospects and the data that you uncovered so far before it became more mainstream than it is now. So shouts to RotoViz, definitely check them out. You guys can find all my stuff over on lateround.com. Make sure you're ordering that draft guide, a lot of game theory stuff in it, a lot of stuff that, we talked about on today's show. And then obviously the players to target, avoid, dart throws, and rankings will update each week. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You can check this out on YouTube as well, youtube.com/@lateroundff. But otherwise, everyone, have a great weekend, and thanks for tuning in.